And I'll be refuting Christian Garcia's speech about cultured beef. His claim was that cultured beef has many positive effects for a substantial population. His secondary claims were that cultured beef is healthier for the consumer, cultured beef requires much less resources, and cultured beef is less destructive to animals. To respond to my opponent's first claim, which is that cultured beef is healthier for the consumer, and he supported that with that there's less fat and less diseases in cultured beef. And to respond to those claims, there is insufficient evidence presented to support the claim that cultured beef is healthier than regular beef. Just because there's less fat in food doesn't mean that it is automatically healthier. You can eat reduced fat foods all you want, you could still be an unhealthy person. And according to Marta Zaraska, writer for The Atlantic, lab-grown meats still require the use of antibiotics. And that's bad because antibiotics contribute to the emergence, persistence, and spread of resistant bacteria, according to the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. My opponent's second claim, which is cultured beef requires much less resources, was supported by the fact that cultured beef requires very little water usage and little space. To respond to that, cultured beef may require less of a specific resource and more of another resource. Although artificial meat may require less animals and water, you have to take into consideration the resources that large-scale meat production laboratories would require. Time Health writer Markham Heed states that one concern is the amount of heat and electricity required to produce cultured meat on a massive scale. And also, large laboratories may still occupy a lot of space and emit waste that will impact negatively the surrounding environment. And my opponent's secondary claim, was that cultured beef is less destructive to animals. And he supported that by stating that animal-derived components will be eliminated in the future. To respond to that, it is premature to conclude that creating cultured beef is less harmful to animals, because excluding animal-derived components has not been eliminated yet. That is in the future. And according to the writer from Gizmodo, Maddie Stone, cells are often grown using a fetal bovine serum extracted from unborn calves. And that process of extracting those stem cells can potentially harm any animal that's involved in that process. And also, a non-profit organization called Understanding Animal Research explains that bone marrow stem cells can be induced by injecting a growth factor into the animal. This makes them spill over into the bloodstream, from where they are easily collected. This is a common method of extracting stem cells, and we can't know for sure if they're actually harming the animals because there hasn't really been much research done on it. This whole concept is very new overall, so there isn't really much information to analyze. So to summarize, my opponent's claim was that cultured beef has many positive effects for a substantial population. My claim in response was that the production and consumption of cultured beef has repercussions that are not accounted for. And my secondary claims were that there's insufficient evidence. My first secondary claim is that there is insufficient evidence presented to support the claim that cultured beef is healthier than regular beef. My second secondary claim was that cultured beef may require less of a specific resource and more of another. And my third secondary claim was that it is premature to conclude that creating cultured beef is less harmful to animals. Thank you.
Structurally, everything is sound. I do think that you present good counterclaims on a couple of those points. I do think that there should be a little bit more challenge to some of the evidence that the advocate presents. But on your first point, you make an assertion that says decreased fat consumption doesn't automatically result in greater health. That's an assertion that could use a little bit of evidence or even a hypothetical to explain it. I think that would be helpful. argument here that laboratory meats still use antibiotics. You had a good source on that. And if the advocate's primary argument on their original point was that you don't use the antibiotics, and you've in essence shown that you still have to use the antibiotics, then I think that that goes directly to the premise that the advocate presented, and you ought to be highlighting that. I don't remember that that was the advocate's premise, but it seems to me like there is some connection there between the antibiotics that are being talked about. All right, on the second one on the use of resources, I think you've got a good potential counter argument here that says that there's going to be substitution of other resources. We don't really know what's involved in this production process, and the amount, and you mentioned, there's the amount of electricity, the amount of heat that you would have to produce. It certainly sounds like it's going to be an energy-rich, intense activity that's going on there. You also mentioned potential space issues, so I'm not exactly sure what those space issues would consist of, how big a space you have to have. There's not really any explanation of this, and I think this kind of ties into the argument that you're making throughout, which is this is a very premature discussion of this issue. This is an interesting theory, and down the road this may in fact be something that's worth pursuing and might be practical, but right now it's at a pretty experimental level, and they're just kind of testing this sort of stuff out, and to make an inference based on the kind of research that's been done so far, that's really premature, and I think that that's kind of the attitude that you want to be taking on this. So, I mean, some of the points probably going to be true in the long run, but you want to diminish it and you want to put it into appropriate context and say, if you think that tomorrow you can start living on cultured beef, guess again, because it's not something that's going on. It's not widely being produced, and what would be required to produce it in large amounts in order to supply people's needs is we don't even know what that's going to be yet. All right, and I think that would kind of put that into a little bit more context. And then you found an interesting argument about the potential problems to the animals when you're talking about stem cells and that sort of thing. I don't know how significant that is. I still don't. It's not clear to me exactly if we're growing meat or we're expanding the meat production from the existing sources. If this is artificial meat, I think there's a little bit of ambiguity here. Would it be nice if animals didn't die in order for us to have hamburger? Sure, that would be a pretty good deal, but I'm not exactly sure that that's what we're talking about here. And if it is, I think you should say that the advocate needs to provide a better explanation of it, and they haven't explained that clearly enough yet. So I think there's good arguments to be made in challenging the ambiguity of the current status of the issue. I thought it was well organized. You presented it very effectively. And like I said, I think maybe you could have used a few extra ways of doing the contrasting position, but you're on the right track here. All right. Thank you.